forged her signature. And I didn't say a word. Not in the lawyer's office. Not when I saw his face go pale. Not when the detective walked in and set a folder on the table. I just sat there, hands folded, and watched the whole thing fall apart, the way you watch a building you've been waiting to see demolished for a very long time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the night it started. The night my mother died. She passed at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, watching the monitor go flat. The nurses were kind. They gave me a few minutes alone with her before they came in to do what they had to do. I kissed her forehead, I told her I loved her. And then I walked out into the hallway and my stepbrother was already on his phone. Not crying. Not even pretending to cry. Just texting someone leaning against the wall with one ankle crossed over the other, like he was waiting for a delayed flight. I didn't say anything to him then. My mother had just died. I didn't have the words for anything. His name is Trevor. My mother married his father, a man named Gary, when I was 12 and Trevor was 15. Gary passed 6 years ago, and after that it was just the three of us in whatever version of family we could manage. My mother loved Trevor because she had loved Gary, and because she was the kind of woman who believed that love was a decision you made every morning, not a feeling you waited for. She extended that grace to Trevor even when he didn't deserve it. Which was often. He had a gambling problem, which everyone in the family knew and nobody said out loud. He'd burned through his inheritance from Gary within 2 years. He'd borrowed money from my mother at least 4 times. I know because I was the one who helped her with her finances after her diagnosis. She had early onset Parkinson's, and in the last 2 years, the tremors in her hands had gotten bad enough that she'd asked me to help her manage things. Bills, banking, the occasional paperwork. I had power of attorney. I knew every account, every asset, every dollar. I also knew about the house. My mother owned a detached home in Oakville, Ontario. She'd bought it with Gary back in the 90s, and after he died, she'd updated her estate planning with a lawyer named Patricia, who had an office on Lakeshore. The house was the main asset. It was worth somewhere around $1.4 million in the current market, maybe more depending on the month. My mother's will left it to me outright. With a condition, Trevor was permitted to stay in the guest suite for up to 6 months after her death, rent-free, as a transitional arrangement. Her words. She told me about it herself, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold between her hands. I know it's a lot to ask, she'd said. It's your house, I'd told her. You can ask whatever you want. She looked at me with that particular expression she had, somewhere between gratitude and guilt, and said, "He's not a bad person, Nora. He just makes bad choices." I nodded. I hadn't disagreed out loud. But I'd also, quietly, made a mental note of exactly what the will said and what it didn't say. 3 hours after she died, Trevor knocked on the door of the room I was using at the hospice. "I need to talk to you about the house," he said. I looked at him. His eyes were dry. He was wearing a North Face jacket and holding a Tim Hortons cup, and it struck me as such a specifically Canadian kind of callousness, standing there in the hallway of a palliative care facility with a double-double in your hand, talking real estate before the body was cold. "Not tonight," I said. "I've already talked to a realtor," he said. "We can list it in the spring. Market's going to peak." I closed the door. I want to be honest about something. I don't think I fully understood what I was walking into. Not that night. I knew Trevor was self-interested. I knew he saw the house as a windfall. But I assumed naively, I realize now, that he understood the legal reality. The house was mine. The will was clear. He had 6 months in the guest suite, and then he was out. I was wrong about what he understood. Or maybe I was wrong about what he was willing to accept. The funeral was 10 days later. It was a small service at a United Church near the house. My mother had wanted lilies, so there were lilies. A few of her friends came, some former colleagues from the school board where she'd worked for 30 years, a cousin from Thunder Bay who'd driven down overnight. Trevor stood at the front and gave a eulogy that was, I'll admit, better than I expected. He talked about her cooking. He talked about the way she laughed. For about 4 minutes, I almost forgot who I was dealing with. Then the service ended, and people moved toward the reception, and I overheard him in the foyer talking to someone I didn't recognize. "Spring listing," he was saying. "Probably 1.4, maybe 1.5 if we stage it right. I've already got a guy." I turned and walked to the bathroom and stood at the sink for a moment. He thought the house was his. Not partly his, not our situation to navigate. His. Fully. I didn't understand how that was possible, given that he'd been at the will reading, or had he? I did a quick mental inventory. Patricia had sent the will to both of us by registered mail 6 months prior, when my mother had updated it after a hospital stay. I had confirmed receipt. Had he read it, or had he read it and decided it didn't apply? I went home that night, not to my mother's house, but to my apartment in Hamilton, where I'd been living for the past 3 years. I pulled out my copy of the will. I read it 3 times, and then I called Patricia. "Have you been contacted by Trevor?" I asked. There was a pause. "I can't discuss. Patricia. My mother died 10 days ago. I'm the sole beneficiary of the property. Has he been in contact?" Another pause. Then, carefully, "You may want to come see me this week." I went on Thursday. What Patricia told me was this. Trevor had come to her office the week before the funeral and had attempted to contest the will. He'd claimed that my mother had intended to leave the house jointly, to both of us, and that the final version of the will didn't reflect her true wishes. Patricia had told him that the will was valid and properly executed and that she would not be amending anything. He'd left. What she didn't tell me, but what I figured out a few days later, was that he hadn't given up. He'd simply changed direction. I found out because of the smart home system. My mother had let me set up a Nest system in the house about a year before she died. Cameras at the front door, the back door, the garage, and the main hallway, all linked to an app on my phone. It was partly for her safety, partly for my peace of mind when I couldn't be there. After she passed, I left the system running while I dealt with the estate administration. I checked it occasionally. Mostly it showed Trevor moving between the kitchen and the living room, eating cereal at 11 a.m., watching television. But 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a motion alert at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I opened the app. A woman I didn't recognize was at the front door with a folder of papers. Trevor let her in. They sat at my mother's dining room table, the table where I'd done her taxes, where we'd had Christmas dinner for 15 years, and they went through documents together for 2 hours. I didn't know who she was yet, but I took screenshots of everything the camera caught. The next morning, I called the land registry office in Halton Region. What I learned made me sit down. A transfer of ownership had been initiated 3 days earlier. The property was being transferred from my mother's estate to a numbered company, a federally incorporated numbered company that had been registered 8 months ago. The registration date was before she died. The transfer document, which I requested a copy of, included a signature on the estate executor line, my name, my signature. Except I hadn't signed anything. I called Patricia back. I told her what I'd found. She told me to come in immediately and to bring everything. The will, my POA documentation, the land registry printout, and the camera screenshots. I drove to Oakville in 40 minutes. We sat in her office for 3 hours. By the end of it, we had a clear picture of what Trevor had done. He had sourced a document from an online template, a transfer of property form used in Ontario Estate Administration. He had typed in my name as executor, forged my signature, and submitted it to the land registry office alongside a letter claiming to be from the estate's legal counsel. The numbered company that was receiving the property was registered to a holding company that, after one layer of digging, traced back to Trevor and his girlfriend, a woman who I later learned had spent the better part of the last decade flipping properties in Niagara-on-the-Lake. He was going to take my mother's house, put it into a shell company, and sell it. His cut would have been somewhere around $700,000 after splitting with his girlfriend and paying off whatever debts he'd accumulated. Patricia contacted the land registry office and filed an immediate challenge to the transfer. The challenge froze any transaction related to the property. Trevor didn't know this yet. I also found out through the bank statements I had access to as POA, which didn't expire until the estate was settled, that Trevor had made 3 withdrawals from my mother's checking account in the month before she passed. 2 were for $2,000 each, described as household maintenance. The third was $4,500 with a memo that said estate administrative costs. He'd been given secondary access to that account 3 years ago, when my mother was first diagnosed, to help with groceries and utilities. He had used it in her final weeks to move nearly $8,500 into his own account. That was fraud. Forging an estate document and submitting it to a government registry office, that was more than fraud. That was a serious criminal matter. I did not confront Trevor. I want to be clear about this, because looking back, it's the thing I'm most glad about. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call him, to go to the house, to stand in my mother's kitchen and demand an explanation, but Patricia advised against it, and she was right. The moment you confront someone who's done something like this, you give them the chance to destroy evidence, disappear assets, or construct a counter-narrative. You also risk compromising whatever legal action follows. So I said nothing. I went about my days. I texted Trevor a few times about mundane things. When the estate sale was being scheduled, whether he needed anything from the house. He texted back normally. He had no idea I knew. In the meantime, Patricia had referred the criminal elements of the case to a colleague who worked in fraud litigation. That colleague had a contact with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. A formal complaint was filed. The forged documents were submitted as evidence. The numbered company's registration was flagged. A detective named Reeves, a quiet, very patient woman who wore a blazer to every meeting and took notes by hand, started building a file. Detective Reeves at one point asked me how I wanted to handle the moment of disclosure. "What do you mean?" I said. "There's a practical question," she said, "about when and where Trevor becomes aware that the transfer has been challenged and that a criminal investigation is underway. Do you want to be present for that?" I thought about it for a moment. "Is there a way for me to be present at the closing?" I asked. She looked at me. "What closing?" "He still thinks the transfer is going through," I said. "He doesn't know it's been frozen. He's scheduled a closing with the buyer. I found the listing online. It's set for 2 weeks from now. A couple from Burlington. Legitimate buyers, no idea what's going on." Detective Reeves set down her pen. "How did you find the listing?" "He used the same realtor he mentioned to me the night of the funeral." I looked her up. She posted the property on her social media before it went on MLS. Reeves picked her pen back up and smiled, just slightly. "We can work with that. I'm going to tell you what it was like to walk into that room." The closing was scheduled at a law office in downtown Oakville, not Patricia's office, a different firm that the realtor had arranged. There were 6 people in the boardroom when the receptionist opened the door. The buying couple, their lawyer, the realtor, and Trevor. Trevor was wearing a suit I'd never seen before. Navy, well-fitted. He'd gotten a haircut. His girlfriend was not there. She was, I learned later, at a travel agency in Burlington, pricing resort packages in Mexico. I walked in with Patricia and Detective Reeves. A second officer in plain clothes came in behind us. Trevor saw me and the blood left his face. It happened in 1 second, like someone had turned off a light behind his eyes. He looked at the detective. He looked at the detective. He looked at Patricia. He looked back at me. I sat down. "The transfer of this property cannot proceed," Patricia said, addressing the room. "The document submitted to the land titles office was fraudulent. The signature of the estate executor, my client, was forged. The property remains under challenge, and any sale is legally void." The buying couple's lawyer asked a question. Patricia answered it. The realtor said something I don't remember. Trevor said nothing. He was staring at the table. Detective Reeves introduced herself. She explained that a criminal investigation was underway regarding document fraud and estate-related financial misconduct. She advised Trevor that he was not obligated to speak without counsel present and that he would be contacted formally in the coming days. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. The buyer's lawyer asked for a written summary of the challenge, which Patricia provided. The realtor gathered her papers and left quickly, the way people leave when they're trying to calculate how much trouble they're in. The buyers, a middle-aged couple, completely bewildered, were walked out by their lawyer and given Patricia's card. Trevor stood up last. He looked at me across the table. I think he wanted me to say something. I think he was waiting for the anger, for the accusation, for me to finally be the emotional one in the room so he could reframe himself as the victim. I picked up my bag. I put on my coat. "Goodbye, Trevor," I said. I walked out into the November cold and Patricia followed me, and we stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment without saying anything. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. The legal proceedings took several more months, the way these things always do. The forged transfer was formally voided by the Land Titles Office. Trevor was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery of a document, and uttering a forged document, all under the Criminal Code of Canada. The financial withdrawals from my mother's account formed the basis of a separate civil claim. His girlfriend was investigated separately in connection with the numbered company, though I was advised not to discuss the details of that. The house came back to me, my mother's house in Oakville, with the lilac bush she planted the summer Gary died, and the kitchen where she used to keep the good tea in a ceramic pot shaped like a hedgehog. I listed it that following spring, when the market was ready. The buyers were a young family from Mississauga. They had a daughter who was about 4 years old, and she spent the entire walkthrough running from room to room and opening every door like she was discovering each one for the first time. I stood in my mother's kitchen while the agent did the final paperwork and watched this little girl run down the hallway, her voice bouncing off the walls, and I thought, this is what my mother built. Not for Trevor to gamble away. Not to disappear into a shell company. This was built for exactly this. For some family to fill it up. I signed the documents without shaking. I didn't cry until I got to my car. And then I cried for a long time for all the things that deserved it. My mother was right about a lot of things. She was right that love is a decision. She was right that people can surprise you. But I think in the end, she was also right about the house. She just expressed it differently than she intended. She kept her records. She hired a good lawyer. She made sure that what she built couldn't be taken. She was playing the long game, even when she didn't know she was. And so was I. I still think about that dining room table sometimes. The one where my mother used to do puzzles on Sunday mornings, where we'd sat through 20 years of Christmas dinners and birthday cakes and quiet Tuesday nights with nothing on television. That table is in someone else's house now, and that's okay. But Trevor sat at it, with his girlfriend and her folder of documents, and tried to take everything my mother had spent her life building. And he almost got away with it. What stopped him wasn't luck. It wasn't a technicality. It was the fact that my mother had done things right and I had paid attention. She kept records. She hired Patricia when she was still well enough to be deliberate about it. She updated her will after every major change in her health. She didn't leave things to chance or to trust, because she understood, maybe better than I gave her credit for, that the people closest to you are sometimes the ones you most need to protect yourself from. That's not cynicism. That's integrity. It's the quiet, unglamorous work of doing right by the people you love even when you're not there anymore, to advocate for them. Trevor had none of that. He was smart enough to find a template online and forge a signature. But he wasn't wise enough to understand that a forged document leaves a trail. He thought that competence and speed were enough, that if he moved fast and acted certain, no one would look closely. That's not intelligence. That's the illusion of it. Real clear-headedness isn't about outsmarting people. It's about understanding consequences, tracing them all the way forward, and making decisions that hold up under scrutiny. Trevor never did that. He saw $700,000 and stopped thinking. I did something harder. I sat with what I knew and I did nothing for weeks. Every instinct I told me to call him, to confront him, to make him look me in the eye. I didn't. I documented instead. I called Patricia. I drove to the land registry office. I pulled bank statements and took screenshots and asked quiet questions. That kind of restraint doesn't come from being passive. It comes from deciding consciously that the outcome matters more than the release. It's the longest kind of discipline, the kind nobody sees while you're doing it. And then I walked into that boardroom in Oakville and I sat down across from him and I watched his face when he understood that it was over. I didn't need to say anything dramatic. The documents said everything. Detective Reeves said the rest. He lost the house. He lost the money. He lost the girlfriend. Eventually, I heard she distanced herself once the RCMP got involved. He gained a criminal record and a very expensive lawyer. I got my mother's house. I sold it to a family with a 4-year-old who ran from room to room like it was an adventure. I signed the papers without shaking. My mother used to say that the way you do small things is the way you do everything. She paid her bills on time. She kept copies of her important documents in a fireproof box in the hall closet. She told the truth, even when it was inconvenient. She wasn't perfect, but she was consistent. And consistency over a lifetime turns into something that looks a lot like character. Trevor's choices caught up with him because they always do. Not through fate or some cosmic accounting, but because dishonest actions require more dishonest actions to sustain them. And eventually, the structure collapses under its own weight. That's not a spiritual law. That's just physics. And my choices held up because they were built on something real. On records. On patience. On the decision made over and over again in small moments to do the thing that would still make sense in the morning. My mother taught me that. She just didn't know she was teaching me until it mattered.